The most famous account of the Mothman happened in Point Pleasant in West Virginia in 1966 and in 1967. And since this case is very well known, I don't want to talk too much about it. But I do want to cover the first encounters during this time period that made the Mothman famous worldwide. In November of 1966, 5 men were digging a grave when they saw what they thought was a man with wings flying over the trees. And when they got back to town, some of these men told their friends and family about this encounter. And this sighting quickly spread throughout the town. But at that time, no one believed them. But then a couple of days later, November 15th, 1966, 2 young married couples were driving past a TNT plant when they saw a 7-foot-tall humanoid-like creature with wings standing on the side of the road. And as they just stared at this creature in total disbelief, they saw it flap its wings and it started to fly and follow the car. So the driver, scared out of his mind, drove as fast as he could in hopes of losing this creature, but it had no problem keeping up with them. At one point, one of these eyewitnesses stated that this thing was flying so close to the side of the car that she could see the muscles in its legs. And this out-of-this-world encounter went on for at least a couple of minutes before it finally flew away. And when they got back to town, these terrified people went straight to the police department, and this case got media attention, giving birth to the legendary paranormal creature that we now know as the Mothman. Another very famous encounter happened in 1986 when the people that worked and lived around a nuclear power plant in Ukraine started to experience something very strange and terrifying. They started to see a very large humanoid creature with wings and piercing red eyes. And after they saw this creature, they started to get very bad nightmares and even creepy phone calls. And these sightings continued until April 26, as on that day, the worst accident in the history of nuclear power happened. At 1:23 a.m., reactor number 4 suffered a catastrophic steam explosion that resulted in a fire, which eventually caused a nuclear meltdown, and 336,000 people had to evacuate. The radioactive fallout fell as far as Ireland, so this is indeed one of the worst human errors in the history of mankind, and it is known as the Chernobyl disaster. Now at first, they didn't think that this fire would cause a nuclear meltdown. They thought that it was just a simple electrical fire, but they knew that they had to put it out as soon as possible. So the Russian military ordered everybody that was able to help put out this fire. But little did they know at the time that they were all being poisoned by radiation, and about a couple weeks later, most of them died either by the fire or by radiation poisoning. But before they died, some of these brave men and women claimed that they saw a headless bird with piercing red eyes with a 20-foot wingspan flying through the smoke right above them. And these sightings were identical to the previous sightings. Now, since this was during the Cold War, nobody has ever been able to interview an actual eyewitness. Well, at least not according to my knowledge. But these sightings of this creature is very well known throughout Russia and Ukraine, making me believe that there must be some truth to this story. And another thing is, this creature is very similar to what people saw in Point Pleasant in 1966 and in 1967. So could this be another case of the Mothman, as it's believed that the Mothman will show up before a disaster is about to happen, making this case extremely interesting and only making the Mothman more famous around the world. Another very interesting case happened on September 10th, 1978, when some miners in Germany were getting ready to go to work. And as they were walking towards the entrance of the mine, they thought they saw a man wearing a trench coat. But as they got closer, they realized that this was not a man wearing a trench coat, but some sort of animal with huge black wings. And as these men just stood there staring in complete shock, it let out a terrifying screech, and these miners just ran away. Then about an hour later, the mine collapsed. So it seems that this creature saved many lives, as if they would have entered the mine on that day, most of them probably would have died. And the description they gave was identical to that of the Mothman, and this case is known as the Freiburg Shrieker. One of the more terrifying encounters that I've ever heard of happened in 2006 in Wisconsin. One night, a Cherokee man and his son were driving down an isolated road when all of a sudden they saw a humanoid bat-like creature standing or hovering in the middle of the road. At first they had no idea what they were looking at, and the son just kept his foot on the brake as they both were staring, trying to figure out what this thing was. But when they realized that this was some sort of monster, they floored it. And just like in Point Pleasant, this creature started to follow them. At one point, it was able to hover backwards right in front of their windshield, and all they could see were these piercing eyes and its huge wings, and they were also able to hear the sound of it screeching, and the noise it made was terrifying. The father stated, "The first thing I saw were the eyes and what I thought maybe were teeth. It had a 14-foot wingspan at least. It was huge. It almost covered half the road. It was close enough for me to reach out and touch it. It almost hit the windshield. It had a white mouth. The eyes were the size of reflectors. The body was attached to the wings. It had gray and brown hair, but not too much hair. It was more fleshy, kind of like a bat. That's why I called it a man bat, because it looked like a cross between a man and a bat." Now they were face to face with this creature for about a minute or so, then it just changed directions and flew away. And many people now believe that this father and son had encountered the legendary Mothman. Then in 2011 in Japan, a 9.0 earthquake hit, followed by a 15-meter tsunami resulting in catastrophic damage, including a nuclear meltdown. And yet again, before this huge disaster struck, there were Mothman sightings. One encounter comes from an American named Marcus, who at the time was visiting a friend. While he and his friend were walking outside one day, not too far away from the nuclear power plant, they both heard a loud whooshing sound followed by a terrifying screeching noise coming from behind them. And when they looked back, they saw a large creature sitting on top of one of the buildings at the nuclear power plant. Then it spread its wings and started to fly towards Marcus and his friend. And as they just stared wondering what this animal could possibly be, they noticed that it had very large red eyes, but it seemed to be headless. And when Marcus made eye contact with it, he got struck with fear. A feeling of dread just came over him. He had never experienced anything like this before, and he was terrified. And later that day, he went home, back to America. And not too long after the sighting, the earthquake, then the tsunami hit. And the destruction that this caused was just massive. It was the worst natural disaster that Japan had ever seen. Now, one of the earliest encounters of the Mothman that I'm aware of happened in 1926 in southeastern China. And just like in Point Pleasant, Chernobyl, and Japan, these sightings happened right before a major disaster. In this case, 15,000 people died because a dam collapsed. But before this happened, the people that lived within this area saw a creature very similar to that of the Mothman, and they called it the Man-Dragon, making this one of the earliest encounters that I've ever heard of. And I'm sure there are many more in our past just waiting to be uncovered. And since there are many more sightings that I do know about, I will eventually make a part 2 to this series as I find the Mothman to be a paranormal creature that might just exist. Until next time, this is Paranormal Junkie. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and stay tuned.